I'm doing a great work and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop so I can come down to you? These are the words of Nehemiah as he built the walls fortifying Jerusalem over 2,000 years ago, as told in the book of Nehemiah in the Bible. Today we see, just as it was back then, that Jerusalem is the source of heavy conflict in the Middle East, with multiple groups of people vying for control over the ancient city, and global powers weighing in on the conflicts that have been brewing over centuries. Join us as we delve into the mystifying history of Jerusalem and Israel, exploring the ongoing struggles and complexities that have shaped this ancient area for over 2,000 years. Through riveting discussions, we unravel the mysteries surrounding Israel's pivotal role in global affairs, its significance in the Abrahamic faiths, and the intricate web of U.S. foreign policy in the broader Middle East. Get ready to expand your understanding of one of the most misunderstood regions on Earth, here on the Great Work Podcast. All right, welcome back to the Great Work Podcast. Today we have Z.E. Silver. You guys all remember him. Second repeat guest. Thank you for coming back.
My pleasure. I can't believe I'm your second repeat guest. I feel a little bit perturbed the fact that I wasn't your first repeat
Jewish
guest.
Jess?
Oh, well, okay, Jewish Jess, she was before me, so then it makes sense for her to be your first repeat guest.
Right. Second guest to first repeat guest, and now my second repeat guest, but thank you for coming back. Today, I think this will be not so Israel specific, but I'm excited to kind of talk about why anti-wokeness, not that even, doesn't even have to be anti-woke, just like the same narratives that we hear from the pro-Pali side of like, oh, we must all feel bad for the Palestinians, no matter what they bring up upon themselves. I think ZE has found some evidence that it's a self-perpetuating cycle. And
yes. So I'll jump in, and what I started to kind of think of was there was this video that I saw on TikTok, and it was this girl who was sitting in a car, and she was blonde and white, and she was insulting people for wanting to take a break from social media. She was basically like, how dare you, you need to take a break, while kids are dying. And, what is this BS about protecting your peace? There is no peace to protect. And I immediately wanted to stitch it and be like, no, do what you need to do, like for your own mental health. And there's a lot of problems, obviously, with people saying things like this. This is not the first time I've heard this narrative or this accusation. People early on were talking about, how could you possibly go to a party? How could you go dancing while people are dying? And how could you be posting anything else on Instagram while children are being crushed under, the IDF? And all I could think to myself was like, you have been doing the same thing for a decade, during the Syrian genocide. And you've been doing it for the last decade because of the Houthis and the worst humanitarian crisis in Yemen. And you've been doing this all the while, the Uyghurs have been also, being put into re-education camps. Like, you have been more than happy to go about your day because you didn't know about it or you didn't care enough about it. So you can't really, accuse people of doing the same. But then I was like, okay, I'm going to pause because I'm really curious about what is the actual detriment to those who just spend their entire day on Instagram, TikTok, and essentially with an overload of news. Because we saw this a lot during COVID, that people were, stuck inside and all they could do was watch the news, and they were just watching the numbers tick up. And so, of course, how else could you feel other than this existential dread? Because we had no idea when we were going to get out of this situation. And so what I found out was two things. One is, it's no surprise that social media and being on it for an extended period of time, and even news in general, is detrimental to your mental health. There are scientific studies, there's psychological studies that show that if you inundate yourself with news constantly, you're going to feel worse about the world. And I wanted to go back to that, but then there was this other side to it in which I thought to myself, okay, well, what about this idea around victimhood, because there seems to be a connection between the two in which you have people who are constantly inundating themselves with really terrible news. And they are already presupposed, or there's a predisposition to feeling as though that it's somebody else's fault or that something else is happening to them rather than them experiencing this as a result of their own actions. And what I found again was that there was essentially a connection between, weirdly enough, political affiliations, your political party, and how optimistic you feel, but then also then how happy you are. And as it turns out, those who align themselves with the Democratic Party, or as you further go left, those who feel that they have no control over their own lives, ultimately are less happy because they see the world that they live in and they feel as though they have no control over it at all. And they also have no control over their own lives to change it or to change how they respond to the world. And so it leads into this downward spiral of essentially existential nihilism, right? In which like nothing matters. And this connection between inundating yourself constantly with terrible news, and even worse so on places like TikTok that are showing the absolute worst scenes, all the while saying that there's nothing to be done about it. And so, of course, you end up this just terrible, almost like nuclear bomb of just existential dread that is skyrocketing and ultimately just combusts in a matter of weeks.
This reminds me of a couple things, but especially I was talking to Ryan on an episode that came out a few back, and we were saying, so he was like liberal growing up, and you know Ryan knows things from TikTok, but for those who don't, that's what I'm talking about. Ryan grew up pretty liberal. He's an Indigenous persons activist, right? So you tend to think that they are pretty left of center, and he has become a centrist. And we were talking about how in general he was saying like I think it's attributed to Churchill, the like, if you're young and not a liberal, you don't have a heart. If you're old and conservative, you don't have a brain.
Or it's the opposite, right? It's that like if you're young and conservative, you don't have a heart, and if you're old and liberal, you don't have a brain.
Anyways, but so we were talking about if you're young and conservative, you don't have a heart. If you're old and liberal, you don't have a brain. And I was saying, to me, I attribute political leanings of that nature to be like, if you think you need to do the change within yourself, you're probably lean conservative. If you feel like the entire world needs to change in order for you to be happy, you probably lean liberal. It's so fascinating that you send these studies to me that are essentially saying the same thing, where people are outwardly focused, everything needs to change in order for them to have like some sort of happiness, versus people who feel like they have, I think the article calls it free will. So if you believe strongly that you have free will over whatever ends up happening to you, you're better off. And I just thought that, I mean, it's weird because I think two of the studies that you sent point to kind of common sense and logic that like, I mean, yeah, it would make sense, but it's just very interesting that like science is backing this up. And then it makes me very scared for the state of the world. Like when you say these TikToks are saying like, because I feel like we're being told the opposite right now. We're being told to go against our judgment or inclination with these types of things.
Yeah. And this is not to say that it's, obviously a causation by any means. And there's a lot of nuance inside of like who's happy, who's not happy, and what your political leanings are, and so on and so forth. I fundamentally come down on the idea of a much higher correlation between how much you believe that you have control over your own life and your own emotions and your ability to change how you interact with the world. It just so happens, I think, that there is a higher likelihood of you being somebody who is Republican, who believes in that individualism because of just the natural predication for that type of political philosophy on the other hand as well, which is like you can be someone who believes that you have control over your own life. And for many liberals, I would say that they believe that they do have control. And as a result, that's why they get into politics, for instance. They say, okay, well, like this is what I can do. I can run for office, or I can help on campaigns, or I can work for nonprofits. And like this is how I can help control the world. That being said, like I think that they attribute more of the world to a combination between individual actions and systems and institutions, in which case that person is probably more likely to lean into the left. I think where it gets dangerous, and this is where I think what I like to really talk about, is this overall idea of what is that cliff? What is the point in which we really want to help people understand when it becomes ultimately detrimental to your own life? Because again, I don't think that it's bad to believe that there is a combination of forces, that it is both institutionalized, there is systemic, and there is individual, and it's free flowing constantly, right? To say that it is entirely individual is just as extreme as saying it is entirely systemic or institutional. And so that being said, though, there is an extreme point in which you basically just abdicate all responsibility and all agency, that I think is what we're seeing inside of the rhetoric around, obviously, like the Palestinian issue, and basically saying that they have no capacity to change their lives in any way. And also what they think about America and why they think it's so important to get to a point where the system is collapsed so they can rebuild, because they couldn't possibly imagine the idea of doing anything on an individual basis to changing it incrementally.
And it's interesting too, because when we look at the split between people, just to add on that, the split between older generations, people who presumably maybe are not so chronically online, but also people who have done things in their life to be proud of. They've held jobs, they've had kids. And then the breakdown specifically under 24 of people who have not really done a ton yet. And then they're feeling more than ever that they don't have control over their own lives. You can start to understand why that dynamic, in my opinion, shifts from being pro-Palestine to pro-Israel, too, in a weird way.
I think you're right. And even more so than that, because we were just talking about before we hopped on about this new, podcast that both, the latest Joe Rogan podcast and also the latest Bari Weiss podcast that was interviewing the same author, who was essentially talking about how our children are over-therapized, and like we are forcing our children, and to somewhat of an extent, like, grown adults, to be coddled. And this is not to be all anti-woke. I'm certainly not anti-therapy, because I went to therapy. I loved therapy. Therapy helped me heal. But the biggest difference that I see between people like myself and others who also go to therapy and seemingly continue to have the same issues over and over again and never really get through it is, I don't know what their situation is. But what I can say for me personally is that when I went into therapy, and I've now done it in 2 different times in my life with 2 different therapists, but in both times, I went in saying, I feel this way about myself, and I don't want to feel this way anymore. Like, I want to be very clear that I want to achieve something at the end of this. I want to be at a place in which I don't actually have to go into therapy on a weekly basis. And I think it was really helpful for both therapists to know that I was, quote unquote, solution oriented, and that they did not lie to me and say, okay, well, like, I'm going to solve this for you in X number of weeks. But they were very appreciative about the fact that I came in self-aware and said, I don't want to feel like this anymore. I want you to help me solve this. And I don't think that a lot of people who go to therapy want to solve those problems. I think that they essentially want a person that they can pay to vent to for an hour at a time. And this person, what was the name of the author? Because you remember the name of the author.
Her name is Abigail Schreier, and she wrote a very controversial book, and then this is her second book. So
right. And so for everybody out there, I highly recommend you especially go listen to the conversation between her and Bari Weiss, because I think that is really pertinent. Plus, I don't know how Joe Rogan approaches those types of podcasts. But I do know that like the one with her and Barry Weiss was really great because the number one thing that she was talking about was the sense of resilience, and that we are actually raising kids to not be as resilient as they once were. And the reason I bring this up is because of what you just said, which is that older people essentially can look back at their lives. And if you are 50 years old, there's no way that you have lived a perfect life. Like unless you were born into the Rockefellers and you lived with a silver spoon with your entire life, there's a really, really high chance that you have had some trials and tribulations that you have overcome. You've lost a job, you've been rejected, whatever it is, right? You've lost a loved one, you've had a big medical issue. But if you are still alive today, that means that at some point you got through it, even if you didn't necessarily get over it. And you're able to look back upon your failures or your hard times and be able to prove to yourself and say, you know what? I got through that. So when the next thing that happens that's tough, or the next time that you fail, you'll be able to say to yourself, you know what? I feel really bad right now. And it's okay to feel really bad right now. But you know what? I'm going to get through it. And this thing that Abigail was talking about was that kids are not being taught to be resilient, because as soon as they start to like feel bad about themselves, the parents like throw them into therapy, and the therapist is like, okay, we're going to have you talk about your feelings for as long as you want, for however many weeks you want to talk about it. And I'm never going to challenge you or question you. I'm just going to validate you. And ultimately, it's this never ending venting, because at some point they are going to stop feeling about it, because time heals all things in actuality. But they're going to keep saying, well, is that how you really feel? Is that how you really feel? And they have to, and almost they gaslight them into feeling something that maybe they don't, because they're concerned that they are going to like traumatize their child.
Totally. Well, and I want to be clear, when Abigail Schreier is talking about this, she's talking about mainly children, so under 18 years old. She talks about how therapy can be amazing for adults because of what you said. They go in with the problem that they're looking to solve. But when parents feel ill-equipped to deal with just normal feelings of sadness, and what kid doesn't experience normal teasing growing up, or this or that or the other thing? She talks about the loss of a pet or a grandparent. Those are terrible things, but that's part of life. You know what I mean? You probably don't need to go to intense treatment in order to deal with everyday situations of life. Obviously, there are exceptions, but she was talking about over-therapizing, particularly children. And also talking about, like you said, like validating experiences over and over again. If you just validate that someone feels upset, that doesn't make them not upset anymore. It just perpetuates the cycle. And that's why there's so many conservative films, especially, and like think pieces, and all of Fox News is now dedicated to like, we can't coddle these kids. Look at this crazy college student who's crying over this, that, or the other thing. And I think that TikTok just blew up of the girl who was saying she gets so mad she starts crying when she sees religious Jewish people get on a train because she thinks they probably support Israel. And how can that? And it's like, we've created this mess, right? Like how does this girl think it's even a normal thing to go online and cry first of all, crying onto your phone and taking a picture of it? That's absurd. And that's even normalized now. Like, why do people do that? But then to say maybe the most anti-Semitic thing I've seen so far throughout this conflict is she just starts uncontrollably crying when she sees religious Jewish people on a train because they may disagree with her politically.
Like, if I can just quickly digress, because I don't want to talk about Israel-Palestine as much, because I think we're talking about something that's like much more like at the root of all of these causes, though, is while simultaneously saying that Judaism and Zionism have nothing to do with each other, she's pretty quick to associate religious Jews with Zionists. Because why would you think that they're Zionists? You can't read their minds. All you're seeing is that they're religious Jews, but that's beside the point.
It's a good point, though. I'm glad you bring it up.
Right. But to bring it back, I think about my childhood, and when you brought up teasing, like I was bullied, middle school, even elementary school, middle school, high school, like I was bullied. And sometimes I think back to that time of my life. And, I went to therapy because it was intruding into my life in my 20s and I wanted to get out of it. And so when I got to the other side of therapy and I was like, why didn't my parents put me in therapy when I was actually going through this? And it probably would have been helpful, but at the same time, I can also very much attribute the fact that I consider myself an incredibly resilient person, and for a whole host of reasons. And I can look back to my time of getting bullied and rejected all these times, and I can say like that is what gave me my power. That is what actually gave me the strength to literally get through anything. And I've gone through enough, not the craziness that some have, but enough to say that like, this is really awful, but I ended up on the other side of it. And I know that you said that, this is mostly dealing with children. And, Abigail says that therapy is good, for adults, because adults can kind of know when something is happening. They're like, no, like we talked about that. We don't have to talk about that anymore. Or it's like, I actually want to end this relationship. But I think that there is actually a problem when it does come to the leftist spaces around validating experiences, right? Because the same theory that we have to constantly validate, that we can't challenge, that we can't question, that we can't push them to find a solution, whether it's one that it comes from an external source or literally just from an internal source. But that's literally what lived experiences is, which is or talking about something that's going on in the country. And then someone says, well, as an undocumented immigrant, I say this, or as a trans person, I say this. And you're like, well, are you certain that like this is actually what happened? Or is that maybe like just how you interpreted it? And just by asking that one question, they're like, you are invalidating my experience. You are clearly transphobic. And I'm sitting there being like, I literally just asked if it's possible that you could have interpreted a simple miscommunication or misunderstanding. Or perhaps the idea is that someone comes from like a different culture or a different language or a different generation that doesn't understand the concept of pronouns. Like maybe it's just a very innocent mistake. And for them, it's like, well, that is trans genocide. Like everything is genocide.
When
That's
everything's
the
genocide,
problem.
nothing's genocide, by the way, just so we're all clear. But no, it's so true. And also, I mean, there's other studies they've done about this. Like I was watching one where they had people go into a job interview and they told half the candidates that they were underqualified or not qualified at all. And they told half of them that they were qualified. And there was a distinguishable difference between how the candidates interviewed that were told you are not qualified for this position and those who were told you are, or you're a great candidate for this position. The ones who were told that they were not qualified for the position did way worse. And they mailed it in, they didn't try. And you would think that and there are some who, when they're told that they're an underdog, they're going to go out of their way to work harder. But then it's like, why are we telling people you're persecuted because of this? You're going to have a harder time in life because of this. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And science is showing us that. The Bible also teaches that. And we're just pretending that that doesn't all exist. And it's, well, no, because if we don't have these conversations, if we don't validate these people's experience, it's either a genocide or they'll kill themselves.
Well, don't want to laugh at that second part.
I mean, it's true. Those are always, everything is do or die for them. And I don't,
and that's where you get to that existential nihilism, right? Which is that this sense that nothing matters. And if you combine that with actual mental health issues, like for instance, with, his name that I don't want to say because I don't think that you should glorify it, he was mentally unwell. Like I refuse to believe that. I mean, not only did his mom say that like he was mentally unwell, but I just refuse to believe that anybody who would do such a thing, even without the without the theatrics, is just not mentally well. Like I can't, like what is it called? It's the Sophie's Choice or something or the Catch-22, where it's like anybody who was sane enough to you have to be insane to be a B-22 bomber, but they can't allow anybody who's insane to be a B-22 bomber, whatever that was. And I guess the way that I think about it ultimately is because even if you cannot control the actual external forces. Because again, I am not here to deny that racism exists. I am not here to deny that institutionalized racism exists, or sexism or homophobia, or a lot of it does come down in various ways. For instance, when it comes to police. And it's not important to get into that conversation, but rather what's important to talk about is if you are someone who believes that there is systemic racism and understands it, that ultimately all you can do probably in the moment in which you face an unfortunate situation like that is, if you are truly traumatized by it because of whatever reason, because whether it was an actual traumatic experience or because you interpreted it as such, you don't actually have to carry that trauma with you for the rest of time, right? You can ultimately respond differently. And this is why it's so frustrating to hear people talk about this inside of the context of the Palestinian movement and inside of the Palestinian people, because nothing stopped them from holding an election over the last 17 years. Nothing stops any of them from just not choosing to do violence, right? Because again, even if you want to admit and accept that Israel does all of the horrible and horrendous things that it is accused of doing, nobody actually has to respond with violence. And I know this because there are people out there that have experienced the worst, whether it's losing a child, losing a sibling, being removed from their homes, whatever it is, right? They have experienced the worst of it, and yet they have found not only the humanity inside of themselves, but the humanity in Israelis and in the concept of Israel, knowing that the best thing for their people and the best thing for them as an individual is for an Israeli state to exist. And on the other hand as well, you cannot ask a single Israeli without them saying that they either know one person or one person who knows one person who has died as a result of a terrorist attack. And you would think, again, despite the fact that these people have lost children, have lost family members, have been kicked out of, displaced from their homes, whatever it is, there are still Israelis out there who are willing to find the humanity in themselves and the humanity in the Palestinians and say the best thing for me and the best thing for the future of my people is to not continue the cycle of violence. They take responsibility for their own feelings, and they take responsibility and a sense of control and a sense of free will that says the world does not actually have to end. And if I do my small part, maybe others will come with me.
Totally. That's shown, I mean, you can show that so many different ways too. Like, some of the most successful people in America today are descendants of Holocaust survivors or Holocaust survivors themselves. Palestinians who immigrate out of the Palestinian territories are extremely successful, much more successful than like a third or fourth generation American. Palestinians who immigrate here become very wealthy. Look at Gigi and Bella Hadid and their dad Mohammed Hadid.
In general, I mean, you can see. Did you know that, for instance, the yogurt, the very big yogurt, starts with a C.
Chobani.
Chobani. So Chobani is I believe, a Turkish immigrant who started that company.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. And like, that's the thing about America and why I don't understand why so many people are just so anti-American. I can understand, again, criticizing the imperfections of America. But when you look at our country, there are people from around the world who leave everything in order to come here because they truly internalize that belief that they get to be in control of their own destiny. That is the credo in which America was built. And it is so frustrating to hear so many people, for instance, just in the context of American democracy, in 2016 and now in 2020, and then also, of course, in 2024 especially, the repetitive nature of hard leftists basically blaming liberals and everybody else but them for the election of Trump in 2016 and probably what will be the re-election of Trump in 2020. Instead of taking responsibility for themselves when they don't vote. They're like, I'm not voting. You're like, okay, well, Trump is going to get elected probably. And they're like, oh, well, maybe you should run a different candidate that gets me out to the polls. And for us, it's like, well, no, we are going to vote for the person that we think is going to defeat Trump. And we're going to do all of the things. And you can either vote and be a part of that movement to help not elect Trump, or you can sit at home and accept the consequences. And they don't want to do either. They refuse to believe that they hold any responsibility or are at fault for experiencing the very own consequences that they have been trying to avoid by not electing anybody.
The way that exists on both sides, because there are far right people who do that too, and people in the center who do that. The other thing I think that goes to is, again, this like overly therapized, but also just kind of like mindset now of like, okay, listen, two-party system, we can argue the terribleness of it or the good qualities of it. I don't care. It exists, right? And like, how selfish do you have to be to think that if you have no involvement in the political process whatsoever, if you show up to vote on November, whatever day it is this year, that there will be a candidate that it totally reflects every single thing you want in a candidate. The color, the everything, every single thing you agree with. Like, that is there's what, 250 million, 260 million Americans. Obviously, if there's going to be two main candidates, neither one of them will be absolutely perfect for you. You pick one of the two that is better. You don't write Free Palestine in on your ballot like I'm seeing people trending to do, or maybe do that because that'll benefit my side. But, like, you don't do that, right? Like these people, like, how selfish do you have to be to think that if you have zero involvement in a process, that it should yield you a perfect solution? And if it won't, and that's the whole thing.
Right, which is that they don't actually think that they're selfish. They have contrived their own worldview to believe that they are the most self-righteous, that they are truly doing what is necessary in order to achieve some outcome on the other end. And yet, at no point has their strategy worked at all. In no situation has their way of thinking worked. They have no evidence to show that their strategy is the best way to achieve the outcome that everybody wants. And yet they will continue to sit there and talk about systems and institutions and make up like 8 different buzzwords and different prefixes and suffixes in order to make you feel crazy that, like, because you're not up on whatever prefix and suffix that they've combined together, that you are actually a bigot. And that's all that matters. So I don't know where it changes. I don't know how it changes. My personal opinion is that we are going to have to kind of create a real top-down type of situation. I don't think that at this point, a bottom-up approach in which we're just like teaching people about this is going to do anything. The only thing that I think is going to make a real difference is if, for instance, the government does get involved, especially when it comes to like Title VI, and really looking at some of these DEI initiatives that are really pushing this idea that at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what field you're looking in, there's always some influence of racism and classism and patriarchy.
Yeah. Well, and that is something that absolutely needs to be looked at. Another thing, though, I don't know if you've heard the term, a lot of people talk about it, but it's like hard times create strong men create weak, or like,
oh yeah. So it's hard time. Yeah. So it's hard times create strong men create good times create weak men create bad times create hard times, that, and so on and so forth. And it's very possible, and that we are in this situation, essentially every 100 years, because like you had the Great Depression and World War II, in which you had incredibly hard times that created good men, and those good men are good people, right? created good times, and that's what the baby boomers were. The baby boomers created this incredible moment in American history between like 1950 and 2000. And
well,
then
I would argue that was the greatest generation who created the boomers, but right?
well, you're right. No, you're right. You are correct that the greatest generation. You're probably actually no, you're right. The greatest generation raised the baby boomers. The baby boomers got to live in the good times, right?
Yeah,
they
right.
got to buy
Yeah,
houses for $10,000. Right?
Maybe
yeah, they're the good. They're the yeah. Right, they're the weak people, right? They're the ones that, got to buy a house for 10. They got to, live at a time when the movies cost, 50 cents. Like they got to do whatever they wanted, right? The cost of living and inflation to salary was like this far apart from one another. So they lived in the golden age, and those good times created weak people that then lead to bad times in which we're living now. And so one can only imagine, and I'll be very curious, right? Because if the cycle essentially continues, we should essentially be at an inflection point, I mean to say, in which one of these next generations, and it probably is going to be Gen Alpha, because Gen Alpha, okay, I think it's going to be Gen Alpha because they're looking at Gen Z, right? Because remember, Gen Z is making fun of the millennials with our skinny jeans and all of the kind of stuff, but the Gen Z people and how emotional they are and how online they are and all this kind of stuff, it would most likely be Gen Alpha that is going to reject them. And that rejection is going to say, no, like you need to stop crying on camera. You look and sound ridiculous. Just like keep your feelings together. And the people that are graduating college now and over the next 5 to 10 years is going to be more and more of this Gen Z, Gen Alpha cusp, and the Gen Alpha, and they are going to experience a world that is really terrible, and they're going to have to figure out a way to make it better.
It might even be happening sooner than we think, though. I mean, if you look at like Russia, Ukraine, just to like put out that a second, I mean, they've put out things to Europe that like they should maybe be preparing for war in the next 10 years. And like,
probably,
Russia, Putin's been kind of upfront about how he will continue to expand past Ukraine. If we don't give Ukraine the aid they need, then Ukraine falls in some way, shape, or form because the US can't get our shit together and give that aid.
Well, isn't it interesting, actually, because of the video that I made about America World Police and how the hard times and the good times seemingly are correlated with how interventionist America is. Because right after the American Revolution and into the early 19th century, America was still very young and very much at risk of being taken over by either the French Empire or the Spanish Empire. Obviously, you had the War of 1812. And so it wasn't a given that they were going to survive this. And so really the basis of expansion and into the rest of the country was a foreign policy decision, right? And we were talking about this in the last podcast. The book is called Dangerous Nation by Robert Kagan, by the way, for everybody.
I'll take it.
So then, right, in this eventual lead up to the Civil War, but then after the Civil War, we say, okay, we can't focus on anybody else. We have to focus entirely on ourselves. And from 1865 until 19, right? So that's, 50-ish years or so, okay, in which we're all focused on on ourselves. We can't really focus on anybody else. And then what happens? World War I breaks out. And again, like America was not ready to be in a place to be a superpower anyways. But interestingly enough, obviously, after World War I, when America again pulled back, what happened? You have World War II. When America is willing to basically tell every other expansionist government and leader out there that if they decide to do anything, to step out of line, they will mess them up. And that is when you don't have that. But when America pulls back because we want to focus on ourselves or what do we care about the rest of the world and everything like that, you get a Hitler. You get a Putin who says, I'm going to expand into Europe because I'm willing to do it. I'm not a democracy. I don't have to worry about people voting me out. What does that even mean? And all of a sudden, you have the Europeans that are like, well, if America's not going to do anything, then we have to bulk up ourselves. And all of a sudden, you get into this downward spiral. And that's also going to happen in the Pacific if we don't do something about China and then expanding into the Pacific and the South China Sea, because Japan at this very moment is starting to bulk up their military, which is obviously the first time in decades. And, it's only been, I think, 10 or even 20 years since they were even allowed to do so. But nonetheless, South Korea knows that at any moment, like, they're screwed. And Japan is going to get that way as well. And if we don't tamper China, then the same arms race is going to happen on that side of things. And the only difference between World War I and World War II and today is nuclear bombs. So everybody's better start to figure out what it actually means to be involved at the world stage.
Well, and then it's, I mean, if we're looking at like weak people, what gets you into military readiness pretty damn quick? Getting invaded, not wanting to be taken over by Putin, and NATO having to activate. And by the way, we have a recruiting crisis in the United States, so hope everyone starts working out to get prepared for when NATO has to kick in. But I mean, it's part of me, I think that like to fix this, it just needs to be external. Like there needs to be something big happening, I
mean, that's what happened in 2001, right? With 9/11. And I don't know what big thing is going to happen. The only thing I can think of, frankly, is a possible Trump election. Because if Trump gets reelected and he doesn't have to worry about getting reelected again, obviously, he has free reign. No. And the depths to which he will dive over the 4 years is we don't know. Like our institutions could truly be rooted at, right. Yeah. I mean, we like do know, but like we don't really know.
No, I do. I mean, I have friends who work on the campaign, and I remember what they were talking about pre-COVID is what was going to happen within the administration, because I think what people don't realize, this is maybe getting a little too in depth on the US political system, so I can cut this out, but like Trump had to deal with leaks constantly. Now the Biden administration has leaks too that they have to deal with, and but like when you can't even get your own house in order, how easy is it to really do that? And had he fired every single person, I mean, typically when Trump fired people, it was not a great media time for him, like not a great PR couple weeks. It was infrastructure week all over again or whatever it was. But he, like, maybe that's too dumb of a joke, but he, like, if he doesn't have to worry about that, no, he's cleaning house. He's getting rid of all of these. Because really, am I relating some of these government agencies to terrorist groups? Maybe. When you bring in a new guy at the top, great. But when all of the people who have worked there for 30 years have a very specific way of how they think things should happen, and they're gonna keep DEI in place, even though the top of the line says get rid of it. Well, no, if they can fire everyone, it's going to look like people are going to.
I mean, ultimately, more than likely, I think there are two main things that could happen. One is you're going to see. I don't want to make a presumption. So I'm going to try to word this in the right way. If Trump is elected, I do think that one of the first things that he will do, especially if he has control of both Congress and the Senate, is something that has to do with Muslims. I don't know if it will be like another ban from immigration from the countries, if it would be starting to actively revoke visas, or if it would be kind of a standing order that you just don't renew visas for somebody with Arab or Muslim background. I don't think that he's going to go to such an extent where he would start to deport American citizens, because like that would, I think, truly create something. But essentially, under the law, I mean, he doesn't have to renew visas for anybody. And I think you're going to see a huge number of Muslims and Arabs who are students, especially, and they just won't have their visas renewed, whatever it is. And they'll have to leave the country. And I don't know. And depending on where their country of origin is, I don't know where they'll go, literally. Right? I guess they, like, if they're Syrian, are they going to go back to Syria? If they are Lebanese, are they going to go back to Lebanon, back to Jordan, back to Saudi Arabia, back to the UAE, back to Pakistan? I don't know. And so I think you're going to see I think there's a possibility that could happen. The other side of that as well would be essentially like a Timothy McVeigh situation, in which you have a crazy ultra white right winger who takes Trump's rhetoric to the worst degree and, I don't know, blows something up or does a mass shooting against a particular group of people or, especially political. So I have no idea, but I think one of those two things to a much greater extreme than we have seen is going to happen. And that would essentially be the catalyst for whatever this new century's, hard times are going to be.
Well, and if I can add what I think most likely scenario is, probably something to do with the power grid going out, if I had to guess. It's extremely vulnerable. There's a really good book. I forget the name of the author, but it's called The Future of Violence. Everyone should read that. I read it in 2015, 2014, and it talked about actually like what war will look like in the future. And it was less like ground invasions and stuff, which maybe she was a little bit wrong about that because we are seeing that in Europe. And, with how many countries are joining NATO, we are seeing that they're worried that this will continue. But also, she talked about pandemics. So I knew that COVID-19 was coming. Pretty much. They talked about, and then the power grid, and then terrorism.
Power grid is definitely something that freaks me out because there have been like reports of like, right-wing domestic terrorists who have been targeting the power grid. The other thing too that really terrifies me from a foreign perspective is cyber attacks in general. And the cyber attacks, whether it's getting into Pentagon, and that's the other thing too about, again, like the Trump specifically re-election is I just don't think that he takes really anything all that seriously. I don't know who wants to work for him. I don't know if serious people want to work for him. Really, it's not necessarily like the idea that Trump is some like active, spy or agent of a foreign government. I just think that he is literally just like does not give a shit. And as a result, when you don't care, like the default is things get worse and things rot from the inside and something bad happens.
It'll be interesting. Yeah. Cause a lot of that policy is set, like the way he made policy is he would have like, kind of like the business side, he'd have two dueling advisors. So he'd have like a Steve Bannon versus a Reince Priebus. And then he'd be like, fight it out. I'll go with whatever one I think I agree with the most. And maybe the bad side of that is sometimes theatrics gets involved or other personal politics. But it is kind of interesting because now we saw like the people who hated him, but then they went to work for him and then they turned on him and hated him again. So who the hell, you're right, who the fuck is going to work for him again? And what are those competing personalities, or what would those personalities look like? On the flip side, what does a re-election of Biden look like? Does it look like more of the same? I don't know.
So I have been very much not somebody who has wanted to engage in the whole like mental capacity conversation up until about like 2-3 weeks ago when whenever his LCC, the president of Mexico, it wasn't just so much the fact that he just like got it wrong. It was the fact that like it's so very clear that it's getting to him. He's doing fewer public appearances. Every public appearance, there's a gaffe. He is not doing what a president should be doing at this moment, which is like he needs to have been basically not in the United States of America for the last 6 months. He should have been going back and forth pretty much between Brussels, Berlin, and Jerusalem. Like those are the three places that he really should only have been over the last 3 months, because it's up to him. And I personally think that there's a reason why he keeps sending Blinken over to the Middle East, because he literally cannot do the flight. Like he doesn't have the mental capacity. And I think that if he were to ever go in front of like the Emiratis or anybody, like it would be very, very clear that like he is just not up to the task. And so I don't actually even know if he's going to make it to November. I would not be surprised if he didn't. If he does, if he gets to November and he does somehow win this election, which I still don't think that he's going to, I think it will take less than a year for Kamala to take over. Very simple. And so I think that there's going to be a huge issue, because I don't think that the Democrats are going to take the Senate or keep the Senate. And I don't know what'll happen in the House. Maybe they'll keep the House. Maybe they'll take the House. And I don't know how it works when it comes to like confirming a vice president after election. I think it's just the Senate. And so what happens if you have Kamala Harris as the president, and then somebody has to strike a deal in order to get a vice president? And who is that vice president going to be? And I think is going to create a huge constitutional crisis in which you essentially are going to have a Republican Party who is not willing to, is just simply not willing to confirm a vice president, and we just won't have a vice president.
Especially because, do you know that Mitch McConnell's stepping down in November, and
Yes.
he's like the only person who can keep the Republican Party in line in the Senate.
Correct. Yep. I don't know who else is going to have the type of credibility as, Mitch McConnell to get, 51 senators to do it. So again, and frankly, Kamala is not up to the task anyways. She is not going to be a good president. And whoever she picks is not going to be a good vice president. And I just don't believe that we are going to get anything done because she's just not a politically astute person. And if you have somebody like her who is just such an enemy of like the Republican Party. So let's say like somehow the Republican Party, decides to come together to, not to confirm some vice president. Everything else sits under the desk, sits in the drawer. Nothing gets passed. And even if the Democrats keep the Senate, they're not going to get past, cloture. And you're just going to get stuck again. And something drastic again is going to happen in order to change the dynamics of the game. But it's basically stalemate under Biden or an acceleration under Trump.
Things to look forward to. Wow, I'm so excited.
Super pumped.
I'm so excited. We have all these Gen Zers who are going to drum up all of the terribleness on social media.
Yeah, and I'm sure that they definitely won't blame the Zionists for Trump getting reelected. That's definitely not going to happen.
Well, this is really insightful. I'm glad we did this because now I'm thinking about a Kamala presidency, and now I've got that to ponder. Anything else you want to wrap up with?
No, just as a reminder to everybody, depending on when this comes out, or when is this coming out? Before or after the start of Ramadan?
Oh, right. Oh, I think this is the Ramadan episode. Happy Ramadan, everyone.
Great. I think it's Eid Barak, everybody. And I just want to say that going back to the original jumping off point of this conversation, which is that don't blame the IDF for responding to attacks started by Muslims on Ramadan while they claim that they respect their religion inside of Al-Aqsa Mosque and every other mosque that they decide to instigate violence. So, as a reminder to do that, they don't have to. Shalom Aleichem.
You can be very persecuted and not do tea attacks. I know it's unfathomable, but you can do that. Everyone follow Z.E. Silver. I'll have him linked below. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Amanda.